Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how I made this white poet shirt with 2 detachable Jabot collars. Said white poet shirt is actually a recreation of this white poet shirt that I thrifted a few years ago. It's a vintage women's button-up with full sleeves and this little pleated ruffle that attaches to the neckline via these little buttons beneath the collar. While I do like how this shirt looks, I absolutely hate how it feels. It's 100% polyester, so it doesn't breathe, and since I am very prone to overheating, it can be very uncomfortable to wear even in the winter. The fabric that I'll be using for the remake is this cotton lawn, purchased from Firecracker Fabrics, which is a small fabric store local to Pittsburgh where I live. Cotton lawn is thin, light, and breathable, making it an excellent choice for something like a poet shirt. For my shirt pattern, I'll be using View A of McCall's 8460, vintage from 1983 and featuring a collar band with a hidden button front, puffed sleeves, and gathering at the shoulders and back. Another really interesting design feature is the way that the sleeves are sewn to the bodice. Rather than having the seam running directly under the arm, it's actually positioned in a way that aligns with the back yoke seam, creating a continuous line between the sleeves and the back. I did have to increase the neck circumference on this pattern, but otherwise the fit is perfect as is, which is very rare for women's patterns in general, but especially for vintage ones. This pattern does come with a Jabot collar option, but I really don't like how it's constructed nor how it looks, so I instead decided to draft my own. I draped this pattern on my dress form, then trimmed and refined it in fabric before putting it to paper. The pattern consists of these 3 semicircle ruffles, all cut on the fold, and a neckband. I actually decided to make 2 different Jabots for this shirt, one with 3 ruffles and another with just 1. You know, for the days when I don't feel quite so ruffly. I cut my fabric for both the shirt and the Jabots, interfaced the appropriate pieces, then started with the shirt fronts. The buttonholes are sewn into a separate placket piece, the center of which I marked with a line of basting to ensure all my buttonholes would be even. The folded edge of the placket was then placed 1/8 inch away from the folded facing edge of the right body front piece, and the raw edges were sewn and serged together. As you can see here, from the outside, the buttonholes are not visible. Moving on to the back, I first gathered the upper back edge, then sewed the yoke and yoke facings to the lower back piece. One is sewn to the right side of the lower back, and the other to the wrong side, so when both are turned up, the raw edges are completely encased. I then basted the back yokes at the shoulder seams to hold them together. After that, I sewed the back to the fronts at the shoulders and pinned the back seam allowance over the raw edges to encase them in a flat fell seam. I decided at this point to sew on the collar before finishing my shoulder seam so that I could do all of the hand sewing at the same time. I turned up the seam allowance on one neckline edge, then sewed my collar pieces together around the outer edges. I like to use pinking shears to trim curved seams rather than clipping notches because, well, a pinked edge is a series of small, even, regular notches. I turned the collar band out, then evidently stopped filming, but after I sewed the unturned edge to the neck, I placed the folded edge along the stitching line and hand finished it with whip stitches. I also finished the shoulders at this point. The prick stitches are a little more visible on the shoulders than I'd like them to be, but not to the point where I wanted to redo them. Instead, I sewed the side seams together with French seams, serged the lower edge, and hemmed it up. Pro tip, fold in the very end part of your hem at an angle to prevent it from peeking out onto the right side. It makes your corners look sharper. Now we can move on to the sleeves. Since this sleeve has a cuff, it needs an opening in the seam line, so I clipped the allowance to that opening mark, then French seamed the bulk of the quote-unquote underarm seam together. I then folded the opening allowances under and pinned them to be hand sewn, along with the cuffs, which, like the collar, I forgot to film. But basically, I gathered the sleeves, sewed that gathered edge to one edge of the cuff, folded up the other, and then whip stitched that folded cuff edge over the seam. Just like the collar, only a lot less curvy. The sleeve heads were then gathered down between the dots within the seam allowance. Another pro tip, when gathering, you should always pull your bobbin threads, not your top ones. The top thread has more tension on it, making it more difficult to pull. To keep myself from getting confused, I always tie my bobbin threads together like this and leave my top threads hanging loose. That way they're much easier to differentiate. The sleeves were then sewn into the bodice, and the edges were serged to finish. As you can see here, the sleeve seam is technically a little bit misaligned with the yoke seam, but it's minimal enough that I'm not compelled to fix it. After all, what happens in the back of me is none of my business. After sewing on the buttons and remaining buttonholes, the shirt was done, and it was time to move on to the Jabots. I began by hemming the side and lower edges, which took a deceptively long amount of time to do. This would have been the perfect occasion to use a rolled hem foot, but alas, I am footless, so I instead had to double fold the edges and top stitch them, like the Pilgrims did when they didn't have a rolled hemfoot for their sewing machines. Anyway, after that, I gathered the top edges as far down as they could go and marked the center fronts with a pin so I didn't lose it in the folds. Moving on to the neckbands, I turned in the side edges, then folded under one edge by 5/8 of an inch, making sure to angle my ends to keep the corners sharp from the outside. I then pinned the centers of the ruffles to the center of the band, right sides facing, and sewed along the entire raw edge. That raw edge was then pressed up along the stitching line, while the folded edge was placed atop the stitching and sewn in place. I ended up reducing the width of the other folded edge because the band wouldn't have been wide enough to cover the stitching otherwise. I repeated all of these steps with the single ruffle jabot, then sewed some snaps onto the bands. Each band has a single snap that will attach to the shirt collar at the center back, as well as a set of snaps to secure both ends to themselves. To attach a jabot to the collar band, I first secure the center back snap, then wrap the jabot neckband around the neck, and finally snap the other set together. Here's how I put the shirt on. I start with the jabot already attached to the collar at center back, do up the top buttons on my shirt front, snap the remaining pair in place, and adjust. You'll also notice in this clip that I'm wearing an undershirt, which I admittedly don't typically do with my poet shirts. But like I said way back in the beginning of the video, this shirt is made from cotton lawn, which is very thin, and in the case of light colors, such as white, it ends up translucent in a single layer. In other words, without an undershirt, you can see my nipples through the fabric, and I don't know y'all well enough to be flashing my nipples all over the place on camera. Had I had that foresight in the beginning, I would have double layered the bodice pieces to make them more opaque. But that said, this was supposed to be a recreation of another shirt, and that original shirt was also translucent, so technically, not making it opaque was actually more accurate to the original. But all potential nipple bearing aside, I am very happy with how this shirt turned out. Using a natural fiber has made the drape look much more, well, natural. It's softer, as well as fuller, and infinitely more breathable, all of which are exactly what you want out of a poet shirt. Thanks for watching.